Welcome back to this look at Decembers in the good old days. Some of those December days, however, were not so good. December 7th, 1941, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, was a day of infamy. It was the day that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and plunged the United States into World War II. Floyd Moore remembers where he was on that day of infamy. At about 1:30 on the afternoon of December 7th, 1941, my wife and I had started out for the Sunday afternoon matinee in the little town of Canton, Oklahoma. I was stationed there with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We were constructing a flood control dam on the North Canadian River. I was a shift supervisor in charge of construction on the midnight to 8 a.m. shift. En route to the theater, we stopped at the town's only drugstore for a Coke. The clerk on duty looked at us and, in a rather disturbed and nervous tone of voice, asked, "Did you know that Japan bombed Pearl Harbor today?" Surprised and aghast, we answered, "No, we haven't even had a chance to listen to the radio." Canton was a very small town with only about 900 people. Word soon spread, especially among members of our Corps of Engineers and the contractors' people connected with the construction. There were about 36 people with the Corps and approximately 40 with the contractor. The Corps' construction and administration office was only about 2 miles from the heart of the little town. I told my wife we'd better drive out to see if there was any word on this at the resident engineer's office. Arriving there, I found the office open. R. Randolph, resident engineer in charge, was there and informed me that the district engineer had called all the resident engineers that morning from his office in Tulsa and informed them about the attack after receiving official word from the War Department. His orders were to proceed with assignments and construction until further official word came from Washington. Randolph told me to report on my regular schedule that night on the construction site. He also told me there existed the great possibility that we might shut down the peacetime project and be transferred over to military construction shortly. Well, there was no movie for us that day. We returned to our small upstairs apartment at the home of Lawrence Gray, assistant postmaster of Canton. We all sat listening to the latest attack news blaring from the Little Atwater, Kent radio. An announcer on CBS broke into the regular broadcast of the New York Philharmonic.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced. The attack also was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu.
The Symphony No. 1 in F minor by the modern Russian composer Shostakovich performed as the opening work on this afternoon's Philharmonic program, Artur Rudzinski conducting. Japan has attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and Manila, the Philippine Islands, from the air. The attack is developing. Today, Dean Taylor's usual commentary will be replaced by a further report on the Far Eastern situation. We pause now for 15 seconds. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
Believe me, everything heard was bad. It appeared that Japan was ready to invade our west coast as Japanese submarines and aircraft were plying the waterfront along California. This was indeed later verified. History shows the Japanese missed a good chance for an invasion, as we were largely unprepared. And in Washington, prior to the attack, Japanese envoys were conferring with our Secretary of State, Tennessee's Cordell Hull. In fact, they were meeting with him practically at the same time we were being bombed at Pearl Harbor. One of the top radio news announcers at that time was Gabriel Heater. His favorite opening generally was, Ah, there's good news tonight. This day of infamy, however, he began his program. Good evening, folks. There is bad news tonight. Then there was Walter Winchell, whose trademark greeting was, "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all the ships at sea." That night in December, they were all giving it as it was, and all the news was shrouded with gloom. When I reported to work that night, many of the men on the project wanted to volunteer right then and go whip the Japs, as we often said, although war had not yet been officially declared. As it turned out, we were shut down by the War Production Board soon after war was declared. We Corps of Engineers employees were sent to various areas to build airports and munitions plants. I must say that Sunday afternoon, that day of infamy, laid fear in most U.S. citizens' hearts and minds. Not all December days were filled with the smoke of war. Some were filled with the joy of a simple dessert saved for special winter days. Just don't make a mistake when gathering the ingredients. Robert Hutchings explains why in The Snow Ice Cream Incident.
There's never a snowfall here in Oklahoma that I don't think of the winters we had in Ohio back in the 1930s when I was a boy. I remember romping in the freshly fallen snow, building snowmen, constructing snow forts, and having snowball fights with my friends. But mostly, I remember snow ice cream. I was raised on a farm near Waverly, Ohio, in the southern part of the state, by foster parents who were Mom and Dad to me. I can still hear Mom's words of warning, "Don't eat the first snow, Bobby. It's not clean." Mom and Dad worked together on everything from farm work to housework, and they both had the same ideas when it came to cleanliness. I can't begin to tell you how many times I was scolded for not washing my hands properly before coming to the table. After meals, Mom would wash the dishes while Dad rinsed them, dried them with a sparkling clean tea towel, and put them away. When company came, Mom and Dad would prepare a huge meal. Naturally, the guest would offer to help with the dishes afterward, but Mom would graciously refuse, saying, "You came to visit, not to work. We'll do the dishes later." And Dad would agree. But one day there was no way out of it. Mom and Dad had cooked a huge meal for our company. To show their appreciation, the guests, a couple, insisted on cleaning up the kitchen while Mom and Dad relaxed in the parlor. My folks were beside themselves, until at last the industrious duo came into the parlor and announced that Mom's kitchen was clean and they would be going home. The folks wasted no time. As soon as the company was out the door, they rushed to the kitchen and went to work, taking out every single dish that had been used, rewashing it, and putting it up again. That's why the snow ice cream incident was so funny. It was a beautiful late winter snow, immaculately white and deep. It even met Mom's high standards for snow ice cream. On that particular day, I wasn't feeling too well. I was sort of feverish, with a bellyache. "Some good old snow ice cream will make you feel better," Dad said, and Mom agreed. Dad got the dishpan down from the peg on the wall and sterilized it with boiling water. Then, dressed in his heavy winter clothing, off he trudged in search of snow suitable for this special treat. I sat in the living room beside the heating stove, waiting with eager anticipation. Dad was gone a long time. Mom began to pace the floor and look out the window, wondering aloud what was taking him so long. But after a while, the door opened and in came Dad, with a dishpan piled high with clean, sparkling snow. He explained that he had gone way out in the back pasture, where the snow was purest and cleanest. Mom marveled at how pure the snow was as she went to work, adding sugar, cream, and vanilla to the snow, while Dad stirred the mixture while it was smooth and creamy and perfect before dishing up a serving for each of us. We all sat around the warm heating stove, enjoying the delicious dessert, oohing and ahhing about how wonderful it was, until we had our fill. I'll have to admit, it didn't make my tummy feel much better. What we didn't eat that evening was left setting on the kitchen table overnight. The next morning, Mom picked up the pan of melted snow ice cream and tipped it to dump it out. She stopped suddenly. "Layman," she called to Dad, "would you come in here and look at this?" Dad rushed in. He was just as shocked and surprised as Mom at what he saw. There, in the bottom of the pan, were black specks, lots and lots of little black specks of something. Nobody knew what, but it didn't look good, and we had all eaten lots of it. I guess it didn't hurt us any. I think it may have helped me, because it turned out that I had the measles. I was covered with huge red spots that morning. Mom figured that sitting beside the warm stove and eating the cold ice cream must have helped bring them out. But much to my disappointment, Mom never would make snow ice cream after that. She said it was dirty, and Dad agreed.
Not all little girls back in the good old days were sugar and spice and everything nice. Many had a pretty strong tomboy streak in them. Just ask Jan Holden. She was a pistol-packin' mama.
I must have surprised my folks when I requested a cap gun for my 5th birthday. You see, Mom and Dad were firm believers in the popular children's poem which stated little girls were made of sugar and spice and everything nice. By the first day of school, Mom had already sewn me nearly a dozen frilly little dresses, purchased satin ribbons for my hair, and given me a plastic purse with make-believe cosmetics and a tiny bottle of Blue Waltz perfume. It was no use. I was a tomboy. I used the plastic purse to transport my pet spider, George. I soiled my frilly dresses pushing dump trucks through the flower beds. I used the ribbons to tie my brother Fred to his bedpost, and I traded the Blue Waltz perfume for a pirate's eye patch. Mom was exasperated. She turned to my first-grade teacher for advice. Miss Flanagan complicated the situation by informing Mom that it was every little girl's natural instinct to be a mother. She suggested Mom buy me a baby doll and let nature take its course. So off we went, Mother and me, to the dime store. Mom pointed out the most beautiful dollies I had ever seen. There were bride dolls in organdy and lace, dolls from around the world dressed in clever ethnic costumes, and baby dolls that cried and wet and drank from a bottle. I examined them all with a natural curiosity, but it wasn't long before my attention began to wane. Just across the aisle was a colorful display of cowboy hats and stick horses, holsters, and cap pistols. There was a box with a photo of Roy Rogers and Dell Evans smiling from one corner. I wanted to take a closer look, but a red-haired boy grabbed the box and ran blissfully to his dad. I watched jealously as the dad cinched the holster around his son's waist and the boy began to fan the hammer of the shiny six-shooter. He was definitely having more fun than I was. Still, when Mom urged me to make a decision, I chose a small rubber doll with a golden mane of hair cascading past her waist. She looked to me a little like Annie Oakley, and when I mentioned that fact to Mom, she promised to sew a Western outfit for my dolly. Of course, I was too young to realize it then, but I had just learned a lesson in compromise. Annie came home in my arms, and I was nearly as happy as a kid could be. Miss Flanagan beamed when I brought Annie to school for show and tell. I knew she was pleased that I'd left my pet spider at home because George had escaped once during rest time and had terrorized half the class. A doll would not disturb the calm and was destined to increase my popularity, if not with the boys, at least with the girls and Miss Flanagan. I guess Mom and Miss Flanagan were right. Dolls and girls belonged together. Annie quickly became an important part of my life, and I loved her like a best friend. Because of her, I discovered a new way to soil my dresses. Dump trucks were out, mud pies were in. I released George and filled my plastic purse with loose change, pop beads, flowery hankies, and a new bottle of Blue Waltz perfume. My hair grew long, and I tied it back with ribbons, just like Annie's. The end of my story comes right back to the beginning. For just about the time I learned to love dolls, I was rewarded with a beautiful cap gun and holster. It wasn't even my birthday, but I'd finally gotten the very thing I'd longed for back in my tomboy days. I wasted no time strapping the belt around my waist and loading the pistol with a roll of caps. "Goodbye," I called happily over my shoulder. Then I stopped to gather Annie into my arms. Mom smiled. She was nearly as happy as a mother could be.
Did you ever notice how good eating habits and such get in the way of having really tasty foods? Just listen how Eugene Atlas and his brothers lost Mom's apple pie.
When I was growing up, every Sunday morning Mom would bake a magnificent apple pie. The tin she used was a foot square and at least an inch deep. Our square pie had corners, and corners meant twice as much golden crust, unimaginable summits of sublime taste. Early on Sunday morning, Mom and my kid brother Wren and I would meet in the kitchen to bake the pie. Mom peeled the apples while we sliced and cored them. We always argued about who did the most work. Being older, I claimed the privilege of nibbling the cores while I tried to keep Wren slicing. We resented Ted, our older brother, who was permanently excused as he always seemed to have homework. Mom, of course, had the crucial task of rolling the dough. She did this with her usual concentration and no-nonsense directness. Back and forth she rolled, bearing down on the rolling pin over the spreading dough. Mom laid it in the pan as gently as she might have tucked an infant in its crib. 2 pairs of large eyes watched each movement intently as she carefully pressed the bottom crust into place. She covered the crust with a layer of Kellogg's Corn Flakes, explaining, "They're much healthier than breadcrumbs." Then Mom placed all our carefully sliced apples in rows of lofty mountains and peaks. She generously sprinkled the apples with raisins before adding a modest amount of sugar and a touch of cinnamon. Then she covered them reverently with the top layer of crust, deftly joining it to the protruding edges of the bottom layer. Finally, she painted it all with melted butter. Wren and I hardly breathed. We watched with delicious anticipation as she carefully placed the pie in the oven. This was Mom's shining hour. The apple pie was her most direct expression of love and caring. To us, her apple pie symbolized all that was good in our family life. The climax of our Sunday dinner was Mom bringing in the long-awaited apple pie. The golden treat towered inches and inches high, bursting with glorious smells. The pie was always cut into 4-inch square pieces. Our portion of the pie included 2 magnificent corners and 3 nondescript side pieces. The rest of the pie was saved for Sunday night's cold supper. Mom determined who held the power and prestige in our home every Sunday when she served the first 2 corners of her apple pie. The big question, ever sharp and painful to Wren and me, was who would get the second corner piece. Ted, the oldest brother, always got the first, and Father usually got the second. Would the second son someday get a corner without squeezing out Father? And did the third son ever really stand a chance? Occasionally my father did yield his second corner to me. It made me uncomfortable that my father never was honored with the first corner. But even if he had been, Ted would surely have received the second, and Ted would never have given his piece to me. Once our precious portions of pie were set before us, Wren and I banished all thoughts of prestige. We dug into our bonanza ever so slowly and carefully, squeezing the last taste out of every bite before swallowing it. After years of enjoying the great satisfaction that Mom brought to the Sunday table with her pie, events took a strange turn. To our dismay, Mom fell under the influence of an ardent nutritionist, a Dr. Wise. It bothered us some when our daily servings of vegetables increased and increased, when liver became a frequent feature on the dinner table, and when the desserts we loved all but disappeared. But we accepted the changes with some degree of equanimity, until, that is, the doctor's influence affected our hallowed apple pie. To begin with, the already modest amount of sugar in our delectable pie was eliminated. We groaned, but not too loudly. We didn't dare endanger the golden flow. Then came that certain Sunday when Mom brought out the apple pie with her usual pomp and ceremony. But it looked terrible. Instead of its usual resplendent gold, it was an unappetizing muddy brown. We boys shuddered. "You boys are going to learn to like the taste," Mom announced flatly. "The choice is simple. eat it, or leave the table. On that dark day, we learned about the color and taste of whole wheat flour. Somehow, as Mom said, we learned to put up with the color, but we never learned to like the taste. The next blow came within a month. We had already become accustomed to the dry whole wheat crust, but what was this new, drier taste? Turns out that instead of using cornflakes, Mom had substituted Kellogg's Whole Bran on top of the bottom crust. Better for you, she insisted. 3 sad boys glumly finished their portions. Competition and rivalry for the coveted corner pieces was forgotten. 2 weeks later came the coup de grace. Mom used olive oil instead of butter. We didn't finish our pie that day, nor the next 2 Sundays. But Mom was adamant. Health would come before taste. An era had come to an end. Never again would Mom bake those golden apple pies. In the long run, of course, she was right. Healthy food was more important than taste. The proof of Mom's emphasis on health is shown in the fact that her 3 sons are still living well into their 80s, and they still dream of her apple pies.
Alex Jones may not have lost Mom's apple pie, but he lost his mule more than once. Come to think of it, the times he didn't lose that mule, he might have wanted to. Share a chuckle with Alex as he asks a simple question, "What next, old Mike?" If you're part of a sharecropping family, you grow accustomed to moving. My brothers and I did, though there was one thing we found hard to accept. With almost every move, something would be left behind. Usually it was something we children treasured, but which to our parents was only excess baggage. Through the years, we did have one constant, our old mule, Mike. He was bony, lazy, and stubborn, but we loved him. He figured in a lot of our childhood adventures, especially mine. I was small for my age and not as fitted for some of the farm chores as my brothers were. That's probably why I was often paired with old Mike. This was especially true when we lived on a farm in South Knox County, Tennessee, from 1927 into the early 1930s. One morning I was given the job of taking corn to be ground into meal. The corn had been shelled the night before and put into a meal sack. One of my brothers draped the sack over old Mike's back, as it was too heavy and unwieldy for me to handle. I had devised my own method for mounting the mule. I would lead old Mike to a fence or the porch, anything I could climb that was high enough to allow me to scramble onto his back. I was riding along in the Stock Creek community, about where Bonnie Kate School is now. At that time it was only a dirt road. Old Mike evidently was hungry, for he stopped to eat grass from the side of the road. I kept trying to make him go on, and he kind of grew tired of this. Suddenly he put his head way down and slid me off his back, sack and all. Well, now I was in a predicament. I didn't know how I was going to get that corn back on that stubborn mule. For what seemed like hours I worked and worried. Finally, I got the sack snaked up on the roadside bank. Then I hurried down to get the mule. But every time I got him into place, I would run up the bank to slide the corn onto his back, only to find that he had moved on to a better clump of grass. After countless tries, I finally gave up. I was wondering what to do next when a salesman came by. Was I ever glad to see him? But it really irked me to see how easily he got old Mike to stand while he deposited that sack and me on the mule's back. Another time, old Mike and I were commissioned to go to the store for kerosene. Everyone used kerosene lamps for light back then, and, just like the special meal sack, all families had a coal oil can with a small spout for pouring oil into lamps and lanterns. I knew as I rode the mule back with a full can, the oil would slosh out, but I also knew that the storekeeper's wife, Aunt Laura Rule, would probably wait on me, and would close the spout with a piece of wax ball candy, as she always did. A small boy who rarely got a piece of store-bought candy didn't mind the taste of kerosene too much, not if that was all that stood between him and a piece of wax ball candy. But this time Uncle Ed Rule waited on me. On the slow jogging mule ride home, I clutched an oil can whose spout was plugged with a raw Irish potato. Then there was the time old Mike rid the community for a while of two, businessmen. It was Sunday, and we had just returned from church. I went outside to play until Mama got dinner on the table. Back then, you might remember, the noon meal was dinner and the evening meal was supper. Lunch was what you took to school in a paper bag. On Sundays, dinner was special. We might even have chicken. I could hardly wait. I busied myself with my favorite pastime, rolling a car tire. I had just got it going really good when I heard Mama's call to dinner. I gave the tire one last hard push and headed for the house. Well, that tire had picked up so much momentum that it ran right through a plum thicket and zoomed out the other side straight toward old Mike. He gave a snort, wheeled, and ran pell-mell through our cane patch. The cane was almost ready to harvest, and as he progressed down the rows, each stalk snapped with a loud pop that sounded for all the world like a gunshot. This further terrified old Mike. As if in a trance, I watched as he disappeared into some woods. I stood pondering my next move. Should I try to retrieve our mule, or go on in to dinner as if nothing had happened? Just then I heard the pounding of running feet from the woods. I figured it must have something to do with the whiskey still everyone knew those woods contained. The two men operating it must have heard the popping of the cane stalks and thought the revenuers were moving in. I felt their wind as they passed me without looking back. Pappy and my brothers discovered the damaged cane patch and the fact that the mule was missing. They wondered what had happened as they began to search for old Mike. I searched right along with them, but to no avail. He was nowhere to be found. 3 mornings later, we did find old Mike placidly eating grass in the backyard. Several months passed before the two businessmen quietly slipped back into the community. And just as quietly, I wondered what predicament I would get into next. Whatever it was, I was sure old Mike would be right there in the thick of it.